targeted art direction of Edith Finch. And so how best to kick off art direction boot camp to have me, not an art director, talk to you about it. So basically, my name is Chelsea Hash. I was the technical art lead on this project with Giant Sparrow. And one of the reasons I'm here talking to you today is because we didn't really have an art director, no single art director. But we did have a group of people that really loved a project, had their own perspectives, and worked together to make it happen. I was also there for very early and stayed for very late. So if I make any mistakes in characterizing people's efforts, I apologize, but I think this was like the inspiration for how we ended up going together. So this is more of the same. Oh man, that audio. Don't worry about it. So again, this is how an indie game put together an art plan without a single director. Part of it was how we built our plan at our own pace and tried to stay true to a single goal while still not having it all planned from the beginning. And then a big part of this takeaway will be remembering the bits that worked, even though there were a lot of painful parts that were hard to deal with at the time. So this is an example of, whoopsies. I do not know how to operate this thing. Nope. So when we got started, we had just 3 of the original people from the Unfinished Swan stayed on. So that was a creative director, technical director, and 1 environment artist. And so some of the early shots of the Greenlight trailer were evocative and sparse and not quite landing on this thing. So this is an example of how we went from something like this to something like this. So to get started, it all started with Ian, creative director, and we had a little bit of Google image search, art direction. But it wasn't just Google image search. These were all collections of snapshots from movies, personal photos from actual houses that we lived in. All of these built with explanations of exactly what they meant and how they fit in. We had synopses of, let's see, what do I got? These are some scraps from an art direction presentation. We had some art math, where we'd combine looks from one area with some art inspirations from another to land on a final experience. We had no's, definite no's and definite yeses. And so no one could approach the project and say we didn't have a goal in mind. But it was a very big body of inspiration. We had collages for plans for many, many bits of our work. And, in the end, it was sort of a curation. These were specific photos, and yet we were not targeting a photoreal look. These were evocative, and they had certain places and spaces, but they weren't exactly what we were trying to build. So it was that curation process that ended up falling to the job on the concept artist. Well, actually, this is another one of my favorites. All of the hit lists, notes, and plans, that bulleted lists of things that we were going to work on, and my favorite, summary images of what was going on at a given moment. And so we started with some efforts. We had some specific inspirations. We were kind of aiming for stylized. It was very difficult to go from a game like The Unfinished Swan with its stark black and white art style, and then suddenly say, now we're jumping into a new engine with the expectations much higher. Like, what are we actually trying to build? So, we have one on the right, which is a, color-graded forest, and then one which is a custom concept, kind of combining pictorialism and some Art Deco. And so, our concept artist, Theo Aretas, was the first person to really say, this isn't a collage, this is something specific. You're trying to build together the house. What did it look like? We had, this is, again, we still could have been making a game that was very flat. So we had, a bunch of examples of making paintings from some of these collages and turning them into mock-ups. We had many, many versions of the house, the lighting condition, and they were all like, for mood and tone. We felt good about these things. We started building. So this is an example of, we had some pretty strong reference, and in the beginning, a lot of these references started to translate very literally into the spaces. And therefore, Corey, environment artist, and one of the beginning holdover, still with us from Unfinished Swan, built our first space. And so this was a pretty faithful reproduction. We were getting areas that went from concept into their spaces very specifically, and not yet knowing exactly the level of detail. Come on, buddy. There we go. So we were able to put together a vertical slice, with this team. No art direction. We had a lot of inspirations. We were hitting mood. But a big part of it was that, as part of the gameplay, we had this experiment. We had a whole house in addition to stories. There were so many things to build. It's difficult for one person to do it. And there are parts of it, the essence is there, but there are parts that were empty. We moved forward, like you saw in this room was empty. We had areas that we started. You're interacting with objects as one of our main mechanics, and you're jumping from inside a house in one person's body to inside a story in another person's body. And so this is sort of where I came in with a team of character artists, and we sort of asked ourselves a question. Is this, I have some duplicates. Is this a game? Are we going to be the indie studio that makes another game with a person without a body? You look down, there's a lot of challenges. If we're going to have all these interactions, suddenly we're committing to have to build out characters for each one. And yet, sort of for me, I felt very strongly that having this moment and the repeated essence of seeing hands and seeing not your hands was very important. So we started with an outsource, and these were the first two hands in the game. We had Edith and Molly. And it was also, as I was assuring everyone, don't worry, every kid can use the same small kid hands. But, it translated what was previously empty. Is that? Oh, I can't see when it's playing. Into moments like this. And so, despite the concern that this was not going to be enough time, or this was not going to be enough bang for the buck, so to speak, we sort of soldiered on. We went from moments that had read like this in the vertical slice, to moments more like this. Sorry. And then we have these moments of transition where it was starting to change the design. Trying to build something that communicated effectively went from a purely design problem or a purely static mesh problem to the combination of these elements. In early versions of the game, there was no hands in this scene, which kind of didn't give us the opportunity, to silently communicate. Most people, when they play the game, wouldn't necessarily think about who is this person. But then being able to see them again at the end, you have these silent mechanics, things that we didn't have to call out. And so suddenly writing is being helped by art, which is helping design. And this wasn't a preconceived notion. It was just dealing with what was happening at the moment with the assets that we had and the moments that we're working. So sometimes environment art would rise to meet the challenge. Sometimes character art would. And so this is skipping a little bit ahead in my narrative of how detailed it was, but being able to start to build the game around this as having access to it was meaningful. In addition, those previously empty spaces started to be filled with people. that had impressions and motivations and styles. We were still trying to establish what would be in these scenes, because in early versions, we just had white sheets over all of the areas. We knew that we wanted to have a story object in a space, but we didn't know, are we hiding it? Are we making it available? Like, who are these people? Did they know each other? And part of that investigation came through building the characters themselves. Just show a few of these. And there were stories, there are stories like this one where the spindle at one version just had no hands and it didn't need an explanation. But then later, when we iterated on stories like this one, it would have been much harder and much less of an experience had we not committed to that early. So there were stories that we never would have executed the way that we did had we not made these choices in the beginning. And then, I think I might have been overboard on our examples of characters, but there were moments too where we promised there will only ever be hands, and then we started to include more, but never more than we could handle. And so with that information, level designer Chris Bell could go on and take rough outs that looked like this and start to build more bones. Our previously empty spaces were partially empty because we weren't sure what needed to be included. We knew we didn't want it to be overstuffed with the wrong kinds of things. We knew we wanted sort of mundane props. We knew we wanted to have a sense of having been lived in and sealed off, but who are these people? So our level designer went through and revised each room over and over again as we built a better understanding of these characters, and then generated very detailed gray boxes in Maya. He did lots of temp prop modeling, just as quick as he could to put something together that communicated. And then after searching through his image post history on Slack, this is like not even 10% of the level of specificity that design, based on the narrative, was providing to this environment artists. And then over time, like these gray boxes, as we had more in the engine, got more sophisticated. So we had things that looked more and more evocative of the final product being delivered. And so now with that level of information, or this is my fun transition, we could go and not have to make trailers that looked so much like this, and instead transition to a team that could fill it out. So we were joined by some AAA talent, Brandon Martinowitz, and he put together an environment art team that was ready to take all of these experiments and all of this definition and then start to get specific. Rather than just like color and mood studies where, our environment artist was sort of struggling to say, well, yes, it's orange, or yes, it's blue, but what are those blobs? So, we got more specific direction from concept art. We had strong tie-ins from, we hadn't lost the spirit of the original photos. We had photos, we had color studies, but we also had specifics. Like these line drawings are very, very close to what we ended up building. And that allowed us to finalize the look of the house. We have these specific props telling specific stories about people's lives and not sort of consuming with a house with generic fill. This was a house that was specifically for the Finches. Having that kind of specificity as well provided context for the design team. Suddenly we had a big machine that was ready to churn out art. And so some of these investigations where we thought maybe it could be one way or maybe then it could be another, eventually if the game was going to get shipped, we had this pressure that, you had a team of people that could make things look amazing and much higher bar than we had expected before, but it meant that we had to make some decisions. So, in addition to just increasing the overall quality and polish, we started to get distinctive features. We had the ability to really dive deep on individual characters and locations and, and round them out. We also had this is not the best representation, but we had time of days within stories, and we also had a narrative shift with sort of like a behemoth technical effort prior to bake sets in Unreal to allow the house to actually change times of day as we moved through. And then it also expanded our color palette. We were building a range of experiences that weren't just in our dark, moody phase, but turning into like what becomes moody after different snapshots of lives. So these like lives expanded. And so, in addition, another industry veteran, Keith Garrett came on with his experience coming from Naughty Dog. I don't know if he's here. As a visual effects specialist, we had these gorgeous looking scenes that were more static than we wanted. And there were problems, like things that were like not even obvious problems that were solved, but like this moment without the wake behind it was sort of like a bobbing scene. Suddenly with, more effect attention, we get something that was a complete thought. And so, it was invaluable to be able to complete this thought and also do honor to some of the original inspirations, which is sort of like the sublime force of nature. So we had moments in the scene where you're finding out intense things in the story. And we also don't want to fill it with words. So the ability to actually fill it with things that, looked beautiful and were evocative of the theme, made a huge difference. There are things that, could have been just rushed past through that suddenly invites the players to stop and look. We even had small one-off moments after being able to time, oh no, video, why? The confetti comes, come on. Let's see if I can't get it to work. There we go. Where visual effects have specific punctuation. Of a moment. So these were all things where we were kind of building this, it was a boulder, it was a snowball rolling downhill where we were grabbing things as they became available to us and as they became necessary. Without that, we had lots of hopes. We had lists and lists of hit lists on things that we hoped to be able to build in, but it sort of created a meritocracy or a hierarchy where the things would happen as quickly as they could happen, and if you had people that they really cared about it. One of the things that came in sort of late to the project is that we had hands early, we had characters, and we had locations, but towards the end of the project, we worked with a character or a illustrator, Holly Rothrock, on giving the family faces. We had an original inspiration for the project for the book, 100 Years of Solitude, and part of this thing was that these family members were such a diverse and similarly named and stretched out group that we had a family tree. And some of our original desires were to keep a version of a family tree that looked like someone had actually drawn and maintained it. And this was a serious point of contention versus how plain looking could something be and have us accept it as a final product. So we went back and forth on how well can Edith really draw, how much energy would she have put into this moment. But ended up with a family tree at the end that ended up becoming a big part of the actual gameplay experience. We cycled. We made sure we visited every time. It reinforced these connections between these people. And then eventually, at the end of stories, we ended up being able to see these faces in the shrines. And so really, there's nothing more evocative of the group effort that it took to put together this game, come with a final product than the shrines. It was the effort of environment artists to make these specific, carefully crafted props for characters that grew over time, originally, bodiless, or maybe photographs, then they developed limbs, and then eventually bodies and painted faces into these moments that, it took an entire 5 years of development to make. And so basically, in summary, I've sort of, oh my gosh, we can't do this. Can we? Ooh, sweet. It stopped. So in summary, I've sort of like walked us through all of these moments as they perfectly handed off to each other. But honestly, there were parts of these that were tense. It was difficult. We believed in different things, and we weren't sure things were going to work out. But in retrospect, I look at all of these choices like exactly the right choice was made. I have very few regrets in these final decisions, and it comes together as a complete experience. So my recommendation to art directors is build in some process of not knowing and leaving space to figure things out just in time. If we had pre-planned every aspect of these things, there are whole portions of the game that just wouldn't exist at all. And having that space and being comfortable with it, and then rebuilding over and over again, I think we come up with some estimates. We probably made 2/3 as much materials. We built 3 times as much than actually made it into the final version because we were willing to edit and build the right thing. And so, and this is also maybe just my bias, but thinking about hiring people that you trust with the design of the final product and not necessarily just on the portfolio. Obviously, people have to be able to make the work, but I think it's harder to teach taste than technique. So that's my talk. I think I burned through it, but thank you. It looks like I do have plenty of time for questions, so if anybody has a question, they can come to the...
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk.
Thank you. You're welcome.
First of all, by the way, you guys, in order to motivate you to ask some questions, there's like a dozen t-shirts there. So if anybody wants some swag, first 12 people get t-shirts. But my question for Chelsea was actually, you mentioned that you did have some differences as you were working through this. And could you speak a little bit more to the process through which you resolved some of these differences? Because obviously a lot of passionate people there, passionate about maybe different things, but only one can sort of survive through that process. So how did that go?
I think so the question was how, speaking more in detail about the differences of opinion. And I think my summary would be, on some levels, it was a war of attrition. And on other levels, it was just letting the ideas speak for themselves. There's a lot of prototyping that was made with very disparate quality levels to try to prove out a concept. I think I myself put together a series of technical demos. I think one thing was on our original version of the tentacle was segmented pieces, and we were debating if we were going to procedurally generate. And I was like, the artists need to have control over the tentacle. This has to work. So I made this kind of horrific little demo with a capsule and attaching a physics rope to it and just pathetically dragging it around with the character controller. And I'm like this, but good. And so I went through 3 or 4 versions and kind of built an increasingly horrifyingly complicated contraption, but then finally convinced the tech director that it was a reasonable way to go. I think at the end of the day, it was reality was coming down on us. Things either worked or they didn't, and we really listened to whether or not it was true to the story. And so there are some things that, we had avoided for a while that ended up being more necessary. There was even a moment where the game was going to be, or there were some moments where we weren't going to have a house at all because there wasn't enough time, and now you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that almost happened. So, yeah.
Hi, great talk.
Thanks.
I was just wondering, when you have mostly creative individuals who are more worried about creating assets and communicating their ideas, how did you decide producer roles, who made tasks and made sure people were following through on those tasks?
That's good. Well, that's easy. Oh, so the question was, how do we make sure that work was followed through? And that was pretty easy. The creative director, Ian, was very on the current marching orders. We didn't necessarily have a good sense of if everything was doable. But then we had area leads with the technical lead and the art lead that made sure that those subtasks were organized. So some indie teams have a completely flat hierarchy that has no lead roles, and that's something that I find to be difficult. You also almost have sort of like groups of people that are pushing together on an effort, sometimes even if it is a separate prototype. But yeah, we definitely were organized via creative direction.
I was just wondering if mechanics influenced art at all. There were a lot of objects of significance in the stories and things that you interacted with. And I'm wondering if the thing that you interacted with specifically was influenced by the mechanic that you were executing.
Oh man, that's a fantastic question. So the question was, did mechanics affect the art direction at all? Correct? Yeah. Okay. They were so one and the same. I mean, and I think one of the greatest strengths of our open-ended design is that we wanted an evocative experience, and each thing had a hook. So, there was a specific request, there's some things I could have said but called out, but like one of creative direction's ideas was the house was built in a certain timeline, and then all further updates were from items you could have purchased at Home Depot. So to not indulge in in some kind of overly ornate Victorian aesthetic, which also sort of extended to our story objects, where it's sort of like this should be a regular looking object. We didn't have crazy ornate keys. We had it's like the master lock padlocks that were very simple. We had, each of the story objects, they were very difficult to build, and we probably built like 3 times as many. Because the idea was that experience goal, and we specifically, because there are games that have interaction mechanics that are, which I respect this commitment, where you say, you can open drawers, you can open doors, you can pick things up and spin them around. I think the only animation that we reused in that game was the walk cycle. Everything was bespoke, and it was that commitment to bespoke that was to me, a part of the art direction. I don't since blurs the lines between design and art and everything else, but I think, again, if we had said at the beginning, no art, no animation would be reused, I think we actually could have saved some time trying to systematize, just be like, no, just do a great job once. Because there was definitely a lot of time hoping we'd systematize things that was just commit to bespoke. Yeah.
One of your conclusions was building in time for not knowing and for free time. Did you have trouble arguing for doing that in terms of finances and a timeline, or was it pretty easy, or just how did you go about arguing that that time will be worth it?
I think at the okay. I will answer that question in the wrap-up room. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.